Dominus Deus, o salutaris nostre, Dominex Deus, Dominex Deus, Dominex Deus, Deus noster, Dominex noster, Angeli, Arcangeli, Ave Paterti, Laudamur Deum, Domino Majestatis, Lavemus, Soleremus, Gloria, Alleluia, Benedicte, Christus noster, Alleluia,
Hey, how's everybody doing? Hope you're having a fantastic day. It is Friday, April 4th, and we're getting close. It's only 2 weeks. It's only 2 weeks until Good Friday. So we're coming down right to the line here at the end of the Lenten season. And before we finish Lent, as a few of you know, I did a few streams covering St. Augustine and his De Continentia, which is, I think, one of the best succinct patristic works on spirituality. I thought it was awesome. It went over his views of justification, concupiscence, how this relates to the spiritual life, beatitude, blah, blah, blah. His reading of scripture was awesome. His refutation of certain heresies was awesome. It was really definitely a work in which I quite enjoyed. But I asked you guys, because I'd finished that last week, I asked which work you guys would want me to cover next, because I wanted to cover a different primary source spiritual work, because I am all about reading primary sources, and especially when it comes to something like spiritual theology, I don't want to speak of my own synthesis. I don't want to speak on my own authority or anything like that. So I think that would be not a good thing for me to do. But this is why it's very helpful for me when it comes to something like this. We go over a different individual's work. I think that's very helpful. And I think it's also helpful for you guys. Spiritual reading definitely is something that you should, more than almost any other branch of theology, be getting it directly from the sources, right? It should be something where you're picking out works from spiritual masters and reading them. So after De Continentia, I asked you guys, hey, do you want me to do St. John of the Cross? Because I am a huge fan of St. John of the Cross. He's actually my patron saint. He was my confirmation saint when I entered the Catholic Church. And I have always loved St. John of the Cross. One of the first books that I bought as a Catholic was my copy of the Complete Works of St. John of the Cross. It's a book that I've cherished very much. And when it comes to St. John of the Cross, I think that, unfortunately, in the popular mind, St. John of the Cross ends up being one of the least understood figures, right? Everybody, and this is what I did at first, I was interested in reading St. John of the Cross. Where do you go when you want to read St. John of the Cross? Well, you just pick up Dark Night of the Soul and you read that, and you think that that's going to be somehow applicable to your circumstances. And while many people think like that, many people think that they themselves maybe are going through this dark night of the soul. They don't really know completely the context of what St. John of the Cross is trying to say, how to interpret him, how his entire corpus actually fits together. Because unlike other authors, when it comes to St. John of the Cross, he doesn't just randomly throw out different works which are treating disparate matters. Rather, his entire work fits together in describing the multiple stages of the spiritual life. So if you just try to go in there and read a book at random, you're not going to have those other parts of his works, which are going to be prerequisite and are going to cast some light on his spiritual teaching. So what I want to do this stream is, unfortunately, Hassan, he's not able to join us. He's very sleepy. And I really wanted to have Hassan on for this. But what I wanted to do is I kind of just wanted to describe for you guys the works of St. John of the Cross, how they relate to one another in general, kind of what he's working with, so you guys can get the context of where we're going, right? And also another important point is the connection between St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila. Because St. Teresa of Avila basically was kind of like a germ of her teaching is a germ of the teaching of St. John of the Cross. It ends up taking a slightly different form. It's something which is a bit more practical in nature, a bit more stated in a less analytic way. It's a little bit less analysis. It's more fluid. It's more it's something which was written for religious sisters. It takes upon itself a different character, but substantially they're describing the same thing. So it can actually be important not only to read St. John of the Cross and his works in the proper order, but also read St. Teresa and her mansions in the proper order alongside of what St. John of the Cross is saying. Now, when normal people are going to recommend these authors to you, they're not really going to tell you that sequence right there, which is just going to be an interpretive key for being able to understand really everything that's going on. So let me open up a Word document real quick so I can outline everything for you. And that's basically what we're going to be doing today. But before we continue, an important connection to this is mental prayer. Mental prayer is something which is going to be one of those unique instruments in the spiritual life for overcoming vice and for the building of virtue. Linked below, I have an explanation which goes over mental prayer according to the mind of St. Ignatius. So if you wanted to get that, I have that linked below. It's connected, so I thought I might as well mention it. Not that you guys haven't already heard that 1,000 times. Okay, so first, we're talking about the dark night of the soul. A lot of people, when they hear dark night of the soul, because that's really what is oh crap, I don't even have my my screen up. Because really all of these works are going to be about the dark night of the soul. That's just, even the ascent of Mount Carmel, that's about the dark night of the soul. It's not like just the dark night of the soul is about the dark night of the soul and the other things are about other things, right? This is really what it's about, because dark night of the soul is somewhat of a general term, right? Because really traditionally we're going to talk about three conversions. We're going to talk about three conversions in three states. So conversion 1 is going to be the justification of the impious. So here you are going from a state of injustice. So you're going from a state in which you are not in friendship with God, in which you are turned away from God in a state of mortal sin. That's the state in which you're in. And then sanctifying grace, right? This idea of sanctifying grace, the grace which makes us pleasing. Sanctifying grace is going to be infused into our souls. And this is going to be that root and that foundation for the entirety of the spiritual life. So this is why sometimes if you've ever heard an interview where I talk about my conversion and what was super important for me as understanding the Catholic faith, this right here, justification, was very important for me, because that seed of sanctifying grace, when it flowers forth into glory. Grace is the seed of glory. It brings forth eternal life. So the justification of the impious is going from a state, we can kind of call this like, if you want, we can call this state 0, because we're going to go from state to conversion. State 0 is going to be mortal sin, right? And then justification of the impious, this sanctifying grace, as a seed, it's going to continually grow. It's going to continually get bigger. It's going to continually develop over time. And this is really what the spiritual authors, when they're treating Christian perfection, this is what they're going to be covering. They're going to be covering how you go from the justification of the impious, where now you have sanctifying grace in your soul. How do you go from that to, in the end, the beatific vision? What is that normal growth of grace? It would be like if you were I can't remember what the name for a scientist that looks at plants, but if you're one of those dorks who's a scientist who looks at plants, and you look at the multiple different stages in which a seed grows up to a sapling, up to a full-born tree, brings forth buds of fruits and flowers, and et cetera, et cetera. You're going to develop. You're going to look at this chronologically. You're going to look at how over time is this in its natural course of development going to grow. Now, what's very important about understanding St. John of the Cross and a lot of the revitalization that happened in the study of St. John of the Cross in the 20th century is to understand that there were many who misunderstood this teaching. They basically saw the entirety of the spiritual life in a disconnected way. They thought that this justification of the impious happens, and then you have the various stages of growth by the ascetical life. But when it comes to those highest degrees of union, those highest degrees of mystical perfection, they think that this is somehow something concerned with a select group of people. That really these are extraordinary graces, gratuitous graces that are given by God, all of these mystical gifts. This is not something which is in the normal life of development for sanctifying grace in your soul. That's what these authors taught. But what St. John of the Cross teaches, and what those students of St. John of the Cross emphasize very strongly in the 20th century, although there had been iterations of this before, is basically that when it comes to sanctifying grace, and this is the interior principle that connects with the universal call to holiness, sanctifying grace contains those highest degrees of mystical perfection within itself and within its normal course. Sanctifying grace is something which is powerful and which draws us forth to the highest degrees of sanctity. It virtually contains all of those things. So you out there, and everyone who has sanctifying grace, who's in a state of grace, you have all of what you need right there. You have the virtuality to grow into the mystical life. You have that grace, which is the seed of glory. So it's going to also be the seed of all things which are going to lead to glory, right? So this is actually a very profound reflection that you can think about. Okay, well, if grace was nourished within me, if grace took its normal course within me, if I didn't hinder this by my complete lack of generosity to God, if I didn't refuse all of those graces which were offered to me, if I didn't completely hinder the work, then I could, right there, be at the highest degrees of mystical contemplation, which St. John of the Cross describes. So that's the very profound reflection that this tradition is going to have when it comes to the way in which we think about spirituality. It's going to be completely different than a lot of other ways of thinking about spirituality, who are going to view the mystics as somewhat detached from the rest of the Christians. And this is also going to completely provide a different character for lay spirituality. You guys wonder why I sometimes will talk about the role of the evangelical councils in lay spirituality, while I'll sometimes talk about a number of different degrees of mortification for the laity, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it comes from this reflection of spiritual theology. It comes from this reflection that these means of perfection, in their effective forms, that is, in the actual practice of them, these are only accidental, and therefore these are only present as a model in religious who are in states of perfection. But for us, we don't practice in an effective way, but in an affective way. We practice the spirit of the councils. So while we may possess those things, we possess a degree of detachment towards them, which St. John of the Cross actually develops and explains quite early on in Book 1 of Ascent of Mount Carmel, is how King David was said to be poor even though he was rich, because he possessed great riches, but without attachment to them. So this is going to provide a completely different character of lay spirituality if, when you're thinking about lay spirituality, you say, okay, well, they have sanctifying grace. Well, assuming they're in a state of grace, they have sanctifying grace. So what is that full flowering forth which we are directing them towards, which we are leading them towards? Well, if you think it's kind of, some sort of you're just kind of a really nice guy. You kind of, that's a bit of a caricature of the opposite position, but I'm illustrating here. You're a bit of a nice guy. You're able to be very virtuous, but you're not going to have that intense degree of the mystical life like those monks do. That's for monks. It's not for laymen. That's completely foreign to this way of thinking about spirituality. It's completely foreign because we, in the universal call to holiness, everyone who's in a state of grace contains the virtualities of the complete growth of the mystical life, not just a select few who happen to be chosen for the states of perfection. So we have this establishment in the mystical life, very important, the justification of the impious. In the justification of the impious, it's going to take away the state of mortal sin, and it's going to bring about sanctifying grace in the soul. But as we remember from St. Augustine, while we have this principle of sanctifying grace, which is ordering us towards God, we still have many different, not only defects, we also have many different naturalisms. So we have defects such as the effects of original sin and concupiscence and ignorance, etc., etc. But we also just have these general naturalisms that bring us down to the created order and attaches us to the created order. So these need to be taken away, right? They need to be taken away not only as to their sense attachments, but also these need to be taken away as to the intellect, as to the will. This needs to be taken away as to the imagination. The various different parts of the soul need to be stripped clear of this. We also have the ways in which we are stripped clear of even things like natural hope, of even things like natural faith, where we cleanse and purify all of the sort of natural aspects to the various different virtues in the soul as well. And these processes actually of stripping us away, stripping us clean of all of these things, these processes are going to be referred to as the nights with an N, the nights. So when we have conversion, the justification of the impious, this is going to bring about a certain change. This is a certain motion, a certain transformation. And this motion is going to be, as I said, from mortal sin, state of mortal sin, to a state of sanctifying grace, right? And the state that this is going to bring us in, so this is going to be state one. State one is going to be the state of the beginner, or you may have heard this before as the purgative way, the state of the beginner. In the state of the beginner, as purgative way is going to indicate, this is going to be referring to the removal of those attachments, the removal of habitual sins, the removal of all of these different defects by certain ordinary means. And a lot of times you'll get it phrased like this is the way in which, this is the stage in which prudence takes precedence. The infused moral virtues take precedence, whereas theological virtues take precedence when it comes to the illuminative. And then when it comes to the unitive, that's where the gifts of the Holy Ghost are going to take precedence. But really what you have to know is that all of these are going to be present and operative in every single stage of growth. So you have that beginner purgative way right there. And really what's going to be happening here is that's the state. Really, beginner is the name of the state. But really what's going to be happening here is you are going to be engaging in the active night of sense. So you're going to be stripping clear many different attachments that you have. The active night of sense is what's going to be present here. So you have active night of sense. And this right here, if you want to read about this, because this is why I'm going to be reading Ascent Book 1, is the Ascent of Mount Carmel, Book 1. That's really what, and also the Mansions 1 and 2 from St. Teresa. These are what are going to treat that active night of sense. Because active night of sense is trying to clear forth something within you. It's trying to draw that away, right? You're drawing away from any sort of dependence on from creatures to complete dependence on God. So that's going to be the first state that you're in. And then you're going to have this conversion number 2, where you're going to be converted out of the way of the beginner. And then you're going to have the way of the proficient, which is also known as the illuminative way. So, oh crap, no, that's sorry, that's not conversion 2, that's state 2. Second state, that's going to be the illuminative way. So, in conversion 2, what's going to draw you from the way of the beginner to the way of the proficient, right? And then finally, the last one's the state of the way of the perfect. But what's gonna bring you forth this conversion, which is analogous to the way of the justification of the impious, taking you from mortal sin to a state of grace. This is going to be what's called the passive night of sense. The passive night of sense. It's called passive. Can you believe it? Because you are passive to it. Just like in conversion, you may in a certain way have activity which remotely disposes you to conversion, like prayer, for example. Really, justification is going to be an act in which you are, in a way, passive to. You are justified as in God is bringing within you a conversion from state of mortal sin, state of grace. In a similar way, the passive night of sense is going to be that conversion, which is going to draw you forth from the purgative to the illuminative ways, the second conversion. So when it comes to this one, this is actually what's, and then it's going to be mansions, I think 3 and 4. Let me double check on this so I don't get it wrong. Yes, 3 and 4. So when it comes to the passive night of sense, this is going to be that conversion between purgative and illuminative. And what's bad about this is, as I wrote on there, and I think I mentioned, was that Dark Night of the Soul, Book 1, this is about the passive night of sense. So you can imagine that if you are trying to learn about spiritual theology, if you're trying, and this is just like painful irony that this ends up being the one that gets recommended to everyone, is, oh, read Dark Night of the Soul, read Dark Night of the Soul. The painful irony about this is actually talking about the conversion from the purgative to the illuminative way. So this is not what you should be reading at first. Rather, what you should be reading at first, because this is going to concern the majority of people in a state of grace, is going to be, you want to read about the purgative way, right? You want to read about the night of sense, the active night of sense. Sorry, the active night of sense, because you are active in it. Whereas passive night of sense, because you are passive to something happening to you. So that right there, Dark Night of the Soul, Book 1, and Mansions 3 and 4, this is going to be the passive night of sense. So because I'm reviewing Ascent of Mount Carmel, Book 1, this is what I'm going to be reviewing for the rest of Lent. We are going to be going over the active night of sense. We'll be going over it in detail. St. John of the Cross, he's a very good writer, and he's going to provide different arguments, illustrations, applications, signs, etc., which are going to be very helpful for the generality of people. It would make no sense for me to go over Dark Night of the Soul, Book 1, because if I went over Dark Night of the Soul, Book 1, it's going to be something which is not going to concern the majority of people, right? So the passive night of sense, that's actually that second conversion. It's sort of like a motion, right? When we consider the different states, the beginner, proficient, perfect, when we're considering these different states are going to concern things statically taken, right? It's going to concern individuals in what they possess. Whereas when we're considering the conversions, we're going to be considering, or the nights really, we're going to be considering the motions of the soul. Like what are they? What are the dominoes falling towards? How is grace actually dynamically, by our working and by God's working, how is grace dynamically going, right? These are all connected with one another. Okay. Then in the illuminative way, what you're doing is just like in the purgative way, you have the active night of the sense. That's what you're doing, working towards, obviously, the illuminative way. Right here, you have the active night of spirit. The active night of spirit, which is going to be the stripping forth of even all of those human and natural aspects of all of those, like even natural hope dies here. So even natural faith is going to die here. All of these, even like these natural virtues, are going to be completely stripped of their natural and human aspects, and they're going to be completely purified in the fire of divine love. And this is going to end up with the transforming union. But right here with the active night of spirit, this is going to be what's going on in the illuminative way. So this is going to be treated in Ascent of Mount Carmel, Book 1. And then this is going to be Mansions, if I'm remembering correctly. Oh no, this is not going to be something which is treated in the Mansions. I forgot. Oh no, I actually messed up. Mansions 3 and 4 is supposed to go right here. Oops. Ignore what I said. Ignore what I said before. I thought I was messing up right there, but yes, Mansions 3 and 4 do go for the illuminative way. Sorry, if you already wrote a note on that, cross it off. I was wrong about that. So that's going to be Ascent of Mount Carmel, not Book 1, Book 2 and 3, and then Mansions 3 and 4. This is going to be concerned with that active night of spirit, right? And then we're going to have Conversion 3, so going from the illuminative to the unitive, and then also another thing that I forgot is there's another work called the Spiritual Canticle. Spiritual Canticle 1 through 21 is going to be concerned with the active night of the spirit. And then Conversion 3, just like we had the passive night of sense, we're going to have the passive night of spirit. So passive night of spirit is going to be from the illuminative to the unitive ways. So when it comes to this is going to be Dark Night of the Soul, Book 2. And then it's going to, I think, just Dark Night of the Soul, Book 2. Yeah, Dark Night of the Soul, Book 2. That's all that he wrote about it. And that's going to be that third conversion, which takes us from the illuminative to the unitive. And then we're going to have state number 3. So state number 3, unitive way. And this is going to be treated in an entire work called The Living Flame of Love. This is going to be what he writes about the transforming union, where we're transformed completely into God. This is the living flame of love. And then it's going to be the remainder of the spiritual canticle as well. Which, I mean, when it comes to that sort of stuff, I've read the living flame of love before, but it's not really going to be immediately applicable, as I think there's a certain counsel that I believe it's St. John of the Cross gives it. A certain counsel that he gives that when it comes to reading those later works, like reading the Living Flame of Love or reading the ends of the Spiritual Canticle or something like that, places where, most people watching this are not in the transforming union. Reading that sort of stuff can be helpful insofar as you kind of keep your eye on the prize, right? You're keeping your eye on, where you're going in the future. Obviously, you shouldn't dedicate most of your time to looking towards the future. You need to be working on the now. But this stuff is still important to at least generally be aware of and have some sort of familiarity with. So that is right there in sort of 30 minutes, a kind of complete overview of what's going on. It's unfortunately a huge disaster, massive disaster, that a lot of people are going to think that Dark Night of the Soul means that I'm like super sad, or Dark Night of the Soul means that it's kind of hard to pray right now, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, I should read the Dark Night of the Soul because he's going to say some nice things and make me feel better. That's what a lot of people think the Dark Night of the Soul is about. It's absolutely not about that. It's about something completely different. But yes, that's the general overview. Okay. Yeah, there's a you finished all of St. John of or did you read Collected Works of St. John of the Cross? Awesome. Yeah, ideally, mysticism I've heard is best with your spiritual director because the complexity of the subjects treated. It'd be easy for people to think they understand it when they've misunderstood parts. I mean, a lot of it, there's a few difficulties here. There's a statement from St. Teresa Oh yeah, I forgot to add the last mansions in 6 and 7 or for the unitive way. Yeah, the last two. 5 through 7. Sorry. Um, so when it comes to Saint Teresa, she has a certain saying, which is basically like, uh, "You're lucky to find one good spiritual director out of 100. Most spiritual directors are going to do more harm than good." And basically, what she means by this is not that obviously you have to discount any sort of use of spiritual directors or anything like that, but that it actually can be helpful to read those approved authors, because there's the no matter what you're going to engage in life, there's always going to be a risk of misunderstanding. Like even the counsels that are given to you by your spiritual director, there's going to be a risk of misunderstanding. So if one is diligent and one is careful and one is docile to correction on understanding different things that they're reading, it's not necessarily going to be harmful to read about this sort of thing. I mean, otherwise it wouldn't be widely distributed, written, widely distributed, etc. Um, but yes, it's a delicate balance that needs to be struck for sure. But it I think would be very incorrect to say that we just shouldn't read about mystical theology because we're laymen. Oh, it's mainly applied to this interior castle. Oh. Mm-mm. Yeah. Also, I think this is important. Leo the 13th says it's morally necessary for everyone to have a spiritual director in order to progress in the spiritual life. Yes, but what we have to remember is that spiritual direction is it doesn't necessarily take the form in which a lot of us view it as, which is basically like the way in which Jesuits do spiritual direction. The way in which Jesuits do spiritual direction, I'm not saying anything wrong about it. I'm a huge fan of the way in which they do it. But historically, the use and role of a spiritual director over different periods of time would take different shapes amongst different groups. So, for example, the it's to my knowledge, I spoke with a Dominican about this. To my knowledge, the Dominican tradition, for example, has had a much more hands-off approach, much more like, "Hey, if you got questions, come and ask me, and we'll have an occasional meeting," and not, let's go over these particular prayers and meet every week for the rest of your life. So it really is to be remembered that spiritual direction does not necessarily need to happen in one particular shape or form. And for each individual, it's going to matter as to different traditions, temperaments, etc. And a lot of times, those comments about the necessity of teaching from others, the moral necessity of teaching from others, or direction from others, in order to um, in order to achieve the fullness of the mystical life, is not necessarily going to be advocating for a particular form of spiritual direction over a different form of spiritual director. You, Scholasticus, do you generally agree with what I said? I want to clarify lest anybody misinterpret it, because generally speaking, when you say spiritual director, everyone basically just thinks of the Jesuit form and they freak out like, "Oh no, I'm not, like, I don't have a spiritual director. Like, what am I going to do?" Okay. The big yellow book, so true. Yes, Dark Knight of the Soul is a part two to Ascent of Mount Carmel. Yes, because in Dark, basically Ascent of Mount Carmel, he wanted to treat like the active aspects of the mystical life. He wants to like treat like what you're doing. Whereas when it comes to Dark Knight of the Soul, he wants to be treating more what's getting done to you. That's like a wildly simplistic, completely oversimplification. Blah blah blah. You can say whatever. But generally speaking, if you kind of want the general outlines, that's one's treating the active, one's treating the passive aspects. So actually, what that leads to is you need to read, the works while you're reading the other ones. You need to do the first and the first, and then the second and the third and then the second. You can't just read through one book and then read through the other book. I mean, technically you could do that, but it's going to be much more helpful if you're reading it if you have a mind like me, you're reading in a logical order of like what's going on and the way in which things are growing. I found that to be much more helpful for myself. Okay. I'm a huge fan of Pope Saint Gregory the Great's book on Saint Benedict. I've actually been reading the Moralia in Job. I need to get back to that. It's my goal this year. By the end of the year, I want to finish the Moralia on Job. It's 3 volumes. I would show you right now, but I only have 2 volumes on my desk. One of the other volumes next to my bed, but unfortunate. Okay, this is an extremely good question. I'm very glad that you asked this. Could a non-Catholic in the state of grace reach the end of the purgative way, provided they follow the morals of the Church, like good faith sedevacantists? Well, sedevacantists would be slightly different, because they have, um, because really the difficulty is going to be because yeah, sure, a good faith sedevacantist, sure, that's going to be a much different question than like a Muslim. For example, if we happen to have a Muslim who is in a state of grace, assuming you believe in the ability for those with merely implicit faith of the Trinity and incarnation that they can be in a state of grace, assuming that, for sake of argument. Or we can think about different Christian groups who explicitly believe in the Trinity and incarnation, but they don't, like, they're very devoid of the traditional spiritual practices of the Church. Basically, the teaching on this gets really dicey, because on the one hand, you do have a lot of the aspects of the development of mystical theology, even in like Shades and Figures. Garrigou Lagrange actually talks about this. In Shades and Figures, you have different aspects of mystical teaching which are present in like Muslim authors, for example. Now, where does this come from? Does this come from like actual experience? Does this come from they took it from somebody else? Like, where the heck does this come from? And that's a really good question to ask. Where the heck did all of this come from? Garrigou Lagrange, in particular, if I remember what his judgment is basically that, well, it's technically possible to have a good faith Muslim who is, in the unitive way. It's technically possible, but because of how necessary it is to have all of those tools that the Catholic Church offers. This is actually something, for those mentioning the last night, the Russell and Gunnar stream, this is something that I brought up many times throughout the stream, was that when it comes to the growth in the spiritual life, the Catholic Church genuinely is the one who is the only religious body who presents integrally, notice I said integrally, presents integrally all of those instruments which are morally necessary to reach spiritual perfection. It's only the Catholic Church which provides this stuff. And this is actually a huge motive of credibility for Catholicism, is we see that it is something in which we're the only ones who can, in all of its integrity, provide these abilities for everyone from the smallest layman to bishops. We have works written about them too. So we have all of those tools: the spiritual teaching, the tradition of individual direction, the sacraments, the divine revelation. We have all of the things which are necessary that I could list off as all of those different means. We have those. So because of this fact, even, you may think of a good faith Protestant who is in a state of grace. Because of the lack of external direction, whether through, spiritual directors or external direction through the teaching of the Church and through the teaching of the spiritual writers, it's just not going to happen. But this is a very good question, though. I haven't seen authors extensively treat this. I've only seen this treated like in passing as a sort of illustration of the principle of moral necessity and the virtualities of sanctifying grace. Let me see. Um, Thank you to whoever bought me a membership. I was born into a Catholic family, but I've been a lifelong atheist. Over the last year, I felt a gentle pull towards belief. Please pray for my faith. Yes, the one thing for all of the souls out there that are confused, all of the ones who just don't know the truth, all of the ones who are genuinely seeking the truth, the one thing that you can do is pray. That's the one thing, is pray and ask, and done in a spirit of generosity, done in a spirit of hope, done in a spirit of genuineness. It's more efficacious than you could even imagine towards your own conversion. So if you're confused, just ask God for light to help you in these times. Okay, that's what needs to be done. That's the advice that should be given in apologetic, evangelistic encounters with people, when you're talking with people, and they so many people feel this. You have certain people. This is honestly, a lot of people will be upset with me when I talk certain ways to like other about other or to other apologists or whatever. But really, I do feel very deeply and feel for very deeply the people who are in the situation of just confusion. Confusion, the darkening of our intellects is something which is to be mourned so deeply. It's something which it touches us so deeply. It's something which it's painful. It hurts. It leads to a complete lack of foundation. Like if you have a foundation, a solid ascent of faith in God and in what God has revealed, especially when this is presented through the Catholic Church, you have a solid foundation for knowing what to do, knowing what to believe, knowing how to order yourself. You have a solid foundation for hope. You have a purpose. You have all of these things, but confusion, this sort of hesitation and confusion, and all of this breeds is just it brings about pain. And when it comes to people who are in this situation, they're in good faith. They're trying to seek the truth. It's the I really am not happy with those who are the occasion of this state of mind, because I know how painful it can be. So I really don't like the people who are bringing this about in other people. Especially, some people can be doing it in good faith, and then obviously, I excuse them, but other people are doing it completely irresponsibly. And it's the irresponsibility that I am, or obstinately, irresponsibly or obstinately, I really not a huge fan of those people, and I think that we should be much less accepting of them because of the damage they do. But the one thing you can tell people in this situation is to pray. The prayer is going to be that remote preparation for justification. It's going to be that which is going to beg the mercies of God, and being constant and unceasing in prayer is the best thing you can do in this situation. Absolutely. No, not doing a Q&A now. I'm going to leave soon. You've said many times people's intellects are darkened by original sin where no argument will convert them. I see this in my loved ones constantly. I don't despair over this because I trust, love Christ's glory over evil, but so many do. In short, how do we cope? Well, like from a pastoral perspective, you have loved ones. I mean, I do, and I think everyone does, who are completely like obstinate. They won't listen. they are stuck in their ways, etc., etc. And in many cases, this is something of the crosses of providence, because you have to realize that when it comes to your prayers for these family members, when it comes to these prayers for all of those individuals that you are obliged to pray for, even while the effect of your prayer as to its intended object, so the conversion of this individual, that may not come to pass. You may spend decades praying for something that doesn't happen. But what you can be sure of is the fact that while prayer does not affect that person, that prayer affects you. It's something which is going to make you trust in the providence of God more. It's something which is going to detach you, because these detachments that we talk about in the Dark Night of the Soul, a lot of times you can think of this as, oh yeah, I'm becoming detached from my sense pleasure to food, or my sense pleasure to sex, or whatever sense pleasure we may have. You say, I'm becoming detached to this. But people don't realize that it's not only the appetites which must be mortified, not only the senses which must be mortified. You must mortify your own imagination, mortify your own will, mortify your own intellect. And there's a huge mortification of the will when you have to, when you desire something which you know is good, but for reasons in which you do not know, and this is mortifying your intellect, you see that this person does not convert. And you don't know the reasons. You can think of ultimate reasons, of course, for it, but you don't. Well, you can think of approximate reasons rather for it, but you don't know the ultimate reasons for this, and you'll never know the ultimate reasons except perhaps in the beatific vision. So that's a great mortification of the understanding to not uh, to not know, and to desire something and to have this not come to pass. But you can definitely feel comforted in the fact that uh, these prayers aren't vain. There's no prayer which is ever said that's vain. There's going to be some effect, whether it's in that individual or whether it's in yourself. Hmm. We need more correct teaching on the relationship between the intellectual and the spiritual life. What do you mean by that? Oh, do you mean like the role of, yeah? Honestly, we need. I think that there does need to, generally speaking, be more reflection, because really the way that a lot of theologians and Catholics generally think about this is they think that there's a perversity which follows sin, which is of the appetites. Sure, they would admit that. They would say, okay, well, when it comes to the appetites, you're drawn to lust, you can't control yourself, etc., etc. Your appetites are out of control. We know this is the case with other people, blah blah blah. And they'll say, okay, there's a perversity of will too. These people are choosing immoral things. These people are not doing what they ought to do, etc., etc. But there's not really a consistent understanding that there's a darkness of intellect which follows as well. The complete darkness of intellect which follows. Sin does in many ways make you stupid, and it causes a deficiency in reason. And it's not like this is dropping your IQ points. It's not like your IQ drops from 150 to like 120. It's rather more so talking about that one ability to abstract, that in many cases is lost. There's a difference between abstraction and like the proper abilities of science, and then a lot of the mere flashly memorization and individual analysis and things like this that a lot of people will generally connect with being like smart. So there does need to be a more subtle investigation to the effects of sin on the intellect, and the effects of virtue and mortification on the intellect as well. I think this would be very helpful for understanding a lot of different things. Because a lot of people are like practical Pelagians when it comes to the effects of sin on the intellect. They just don't think it exists. They think that you can kind of just, no matter what, like convince somebody out of their errors which follow from their sins. Um, but what if I don't care about it affecting me? I don't pray for someone for myself. I pray because I want them to experience the life of God. Well, you should always desire your own perfection. I mean, if you're not desiring your own perfection right from the beginning, you've kind of misunderstood what's going on there. And the desire for your own perfection, which is really the desire of your ultimate end, which is God. Your relationship to other people, they're not your ultimate end. Their relationship to God is their ultimate end, but your relationship to them is not your ultimate end. So this may sound selfish, but it's only selfish because we compare it often to the possession of material goods, which diminish when possessed. But our reasons for praying for others, our reasons for desiring the salvation of all, this is something which, in many ways, is going to be for the acquisition of your own end. That may sound really weird, and you have to think about it a lot. But other people, they are not for us ends in themselves. They're somewhat they are to be ordered to an ultimate end, which is God in Himself. So if you're praying for somebody else for their salvation, and this isn't ultimately also ordered towards your salvation, it's kind of a question of what are you doing, and do you have a proper view of God as final end of all creatures, including final end of yourself. Wagner, you skipped my super chats, did I? Oh, I'm sorry. But I don't see one. Yesterday's stream was definitely one of the streams of all time. I already have watched it several times. Also, I love if you would cover a work from the Doctor of Charity, St. Francis de Sales was my confirmation saint. Yes, I've been wanting to eventually dive into St. Francis de Sales. I have not done a like super comprehensive study of his works before. Um, Somebody said something I wanted to comment on. I was more thinking about on the subordination of speculative science to contemplation and the detachment from created knowledge. Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. I think this is a little bit out of my wheelhouse to comment on intelligently, because this is going to be talking about like the active night of spirit, which is very very obscure, which is part of the which is part of the reason why it's not something that I generally would be um thrilled to cover in a systematic way, because it ends up getting very obscure, because the what's important to realize is that when it comes to, and Father Arntero has a really good statement on this, when it comes to mystical authors, the mystical authors are going to write in images which partially capture the truth of what they're trying to communicate, a truth which they cannot communicate in proper language. Like you can't just go out there and see a tree outside of my office and say, yeah, there was a tree, it was tall, it was brown, it had green leaves, etc. When you experience God, what's happening within you and what you're experiencing, these things are ineffable. These things are not. We don't have univocal categories for these in our language. So oftentimes we need to speak under images. So that particular work ends up being quite obscure for me. But I think that's generally speaking. Okay, I guess I'll just leave it like that. How do we reconcile Aristotelian body soul hylomorphism view with St. Paul's dualistic language in some of his epistles? Because the body and the soul are really distinct. Um, how do you know how I can do you know how I can find a good spiritual guide? Maybe this question is too case specific and location dependent, but maybe there are principles. Yeah, there are principles. Generally speaking, it's best that your spiritual director, be your confessor. But, and I know that this is irregular, but unfortunately, we're in a regular situation. But that's not necessary. So, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is that you can, you don't have to be proximate location wise to your spiritual director. So, let's say I'll give this as an example. Let's say you go to a monastery once a year for a 1 week retreat, and one of the priests there, really good confessor, who gives great counsels, et cetera, but you only see him once a year. You can ask him to be your spiritual director and have more or less digital communications with him. And it's not ideal. Of course, it's not ideal. It'd be ideal if you could have more, always confess to him, et cetera, et cetera. But it's something which is possible, and it's something which I think is a beneficial option to have because of the rarity of really good spiritual directors. Okay, well, that looks like that's all the questions I wanted to answer. Thank you guys. I appreciate you listening to it. Hopefully next week we'll get Hassan on here. We'll be able to actually get into the text itself. We'll explain a few things about the active night of sense. So that's all that I have for you. And as always, God bless.